As the world of survival horror continues to grow and evolve, it's going to take different, newer directions. And with survival horror now being one of gaming's most well-known genres at this point, it should come as no surprise that the genre has taken a lot of turns and tried a lot of ideas, with results that span over a wide spectrum of success and failure. With that, as with any genre that's been around for more than a couple decades, many of those ideas have been left in the dark, behind the handful of legacy franchises that have stood the test of time, and the occasional modern classic that pops up every now and then. While there is no denying that the winds of time will eventually blow past everything, there are still plenty of great survival horror games that just feel like they need a revival. Whether they were a one-off that wasn't given enough of a chance to prove itself, or if it was a franchise that just lost its way. Here's 10 survival horror games that, for one reason or another, absolutely deserve a revival of some sort. Before we go ahead, a quick request. We upload new videos every single day, and your subscription matters a lot. So, please consider subscribing and enabling all notifications by clicking the bell icon. With that out of the way, let's begin. 10. Dino Crisis. Let's start off with an obvious one with Dino Crisis. With the success of the original Dino Crisis game that came out at the height of the 32-bit fixed camera tank control survival horror craze of the mid to late 90s, it was a shock to literally nobody that the game would get a sequel shortly after. What was a shock to many, though, was that the sequel was decidedly arcadey, action-heavy, and the horror factor was all but eliminated compared to the original. Dino Crisis 2 wasn't a bad game by any measure. It worked fine for what it was, but with how much people enjoyed the original, it was an odd, sharp turn for the series to make with its first sequel. The series stayed roughly on this same track with Dino Crisis 3 on the Xbox, and promptly faded into obscurity, from which it hasn't emerged for nearly 20 years, other than a handful of rumors that have bubbled to the surface a few times in recent years. No official word on the series has come out, and honestly, that's a missed opportunity. Despite the fact that no games have come out in so long, and with the last two of the three main entries being received far worse than the original, Dino Crisis has been able to hang on to quite a bit of relevance in the minds of horror fans and general gamers alike. Regardless of whether Capcom wants to continue down the guns-blazing action path of the last two games, or bring it back to the horror roots of the original, Dino Crisis certainly deserves a revival of some sort. Whether that's in the form of a Dino Crisis 4 or a full-on reboot, I could see either one. 9. Parasite Eve. Much like Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve started out great, but never made it past the third game. Unlike Dino Crisis, however, Parasite Eve had a pretty good idea of what it was with those three games. While the gameplay became more action-oriented in the third birthday, the overall tone and aesthetic of all three games fits pretty well, and one can only imagine what this look and visual style of those games would look like with the power of games today backing it up. Parasite Eve would be a great bomb drop for a state of play, and would generate plenty of buzz for Sony and Square Enix, so I think it's a pretty easy one to justify for a revival of some sort. 8. Blue Stinger. This might be one of the lesser-known games of the list, but that doesn't make it any less of a candidate for a revival. Blue Stinger was a horror game that found itself stuck on the struggling Dreamcast, and subsequently in bargain bins of the early 2000s. It takes place in a research facility set up to examine where the meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs was thought to have landed. But it turns out there's a lot more there than just meteorite fragments. It fell short in some respects, but many who still remember this game can recall the potential of the storyline and setting. A revival is definitely needed here, probably in the form of a total remake on multiple platforms, to really give the game a chance with gamers as a whole. 7. Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark needs no introduction to old-school horror fans. Without the original Alone in the Dark, the survival horror genre would likely be much different than it is today, with its influence over its successors like Resident Evil and Silent Hill being beyond obvious and indispensable. The series has gone on to spawn several more games, but it's true that the series has somewhat lost its way thematically. A return to its roots would make Alone in the Dark a very interesting revival. 6. The Suffering. The Suffering was not even remotely shy about its unique cocktail of elements. It mixed action and horror, a fictional story with a setting based on a real prison, and a cool main character that was fun to play but operated in morally gray areas at best. The Suffering got a pretty good sequel, but after that, nothing. It's a bit of a mystery as to why this series never continued. Perhaps we'll look into it in our What the Hell Happened series one day. But regardless of why, the series is sorely missed. Being able to tear through prison execution-themed monsters as the hulked-out freak version of Torque is something that gaming certainly has room for today, and I think a third game would be a welcome revival for the series. 5. Condemned. Condemned had a very short moment in the spotlight. Its sequel seemed to have an even shorter one, but they were both good games that combined the tension and atmosphere of the finest horror games of the era with some pretty decent first-person combat, which is something that many games struggle to pull off, even today. Like The Suffering, a third game would certainly be welcomed by horror fans today, and I'd like to see that happen. 4. Fatal Frame. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of survival horror class acts. Fatal Frame is nothing short of terrifying horror excellence. Anybody who has given any of the original 3 games a few hours of their time would have likely noticed it getting under their skin with its dark environments, weaponless, vulnerable characters, and a camera system that requires you to stare horrifying ghosts straight in the face to dispatch them. Japanese mythology and a washed-out, moody aesthetic turned out to be a fantastic combination for these games, and even today, nothing really comes close to what they achieved. In this case, however, with a couple later sequels that weren't so great, and a DS spin-off muddying up the waters a bit, I think a full-on reboot is in order for Fatal Frame to give the series a fresh start. 3. Overblood. Much like Blue Stinger, Overblood just never really got a fair shake. It came out in 1997 when the PlayStation was just hitting its stride with Crash Bandicoot 2, Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, Grand Theft Auto, and Final Fantasy VII. It was a year where a lot of timeless classics were being born. And while Overblood certainly isn't as good as those games, it was still done dirty by the timing of its release, in my opinion. The relationships between the characters were well crafted, and the setting was a fairly interesting science fiction, ultra-cerebral slow burn, which stood out from and didn't really fit in with the more flashy games of the time. If whoever ended up with this IP would like to try it again, I think they'd have a shot at doing something interesting with it, and I'd be more than happy to lend my consultative services. 2. Clock Tower. With a series that has pretty much obliterated its identity with its main 3 games being entirely unrelated to each other, its 4th game being changed to Haunting Ground, and with the original creator's attempt at a spiritual successor with Nightcry failing to recapture the magic, I think it's time that Capcom give this series the much-needed revival it deserves. And there are 2 ways to go about this to my mind. 1, a full-on reboot of the original game. Not the PS1 game, but the Japanese original on the Super Famicom, that many Western fans aren't even aware of. Or 2, a direct sequel to that PS1 game, which would effectively make it the 3rd game in the Scissorman saga. Including the original 2 games for context would be absolutely necessary for this path. But I sort of lean toward this idea over a full-on remake anyway. The original 2 games still hold up, so why not continue the story? 1. Silent Hill. This is probably the most unavoidable one, so I saved it for last. Silent Hill, perhaps more than any other horror franchise, needs a revival. The original several games were just fantastic and hold up extremely well, Even the fourth game and the PSP game, while not as good as the original three, are still totally competent and respectable entries. Where the series lost its way was with Homecoming and Downpour. Again, these weren't horrible games, but they just didn't cut the mustard with fans who were expecting more, and reasonably so. Outside of the somewhat bizarre dungeon crawler game on the Vita and a few pachinko machines, the series has been dormant for many, many years. The glimpse of its potential in the modern gaming space that we got with PT was more than enough evidence that the franchise still has a lot of life left in it. It just needs to be handled by the right team. If recent rumors are true, we may be in for a revival of some sort, but until we know for sure, I'm gonna continue sounding the alarm on this one. And with that, we reached the end of the video. Have anything to say? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we upload new videos every single day on Gaming Bolt, so please consider subscribing as it really helps us out. Thanks for watching.